As I examine the latest warning from Moscow, the declaration that the next strike will hit NATO directly, I see not a rhetorical flourish, but the predictable outcome of structural forces that have been in motion for more than 3 decades in the realm of great power politics. Deterrence is never a matter of choice. It is the logic imposed by an anarchic international system where no higher authority exists to protect states from one another. Under those conditions, every major power must signal resolve with absolute clarity, especially when confronted with actions it views as threatening its survival. Russia is doing exactly that. The West may be shocked by the bluntness of Moscow's warning, but anyone who understands power politics should have expected it. From the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, I watched NATO's decision-making process drift steadily toward the illusion that escalation could be managed indefinitely. Western policymakers convinced themselves that sending longer-range missiles, providing real-time targeting data, and assisting with operational planning would remain below Russia's red lines because the West believed Russia was bluffing. That assumption rested on the belief that Russia lacked both the capability and the willingness to respond forcefully. It was a profound misreading of Russian strategic culture and an equally deep misunderstanding of how nuclear-armed great powers behave when they perceive existential threats. In Moscow's eyes, Western involvement in Ukraine long ago crossed from indirect support into direct participation. When Russian leaders look at the battlefield, they do not simply see Ukrainian forces making independent decisions. They see a war increasingly shaped by Western intelligence, Western weapons, and Western political imperatives. They see strikes inside Crimea, Belgar, and other territories that would have been impossible without NATO-guided systems. And they see a steady erosion of the boundaries that once separated Ukraine's military operations from NATO's strategic will. Under those conditions, Russia believes it must restore deterrence through unmistakable signals, including the threat of striking NATO assets if the escalation continues. Western analysts often dismiss these warnings as bluster, but history suggests otherwise. Great powers rarely bluff about issues they define as core security interests. If you look at the United States, consider how Washington has behaved whenever it felt its sphere of influence was challenged. From the Cuban Missile Crisis to the interventions throughout Latin America, the United States has consistently demonstrated that it will use overwhelming force to preserve what it views as vital interests. Russia operates according to the same logic. It cannot afford to lose in Ukraine, and it cannot tolerate strikes deep inside its territory enabled by NATO weaponry. Once Washington and European capitals decided to help Ukraine contest those territories, escalation became inevitable. The tragedy here is that Western policymakers seem genuinely surprised by Russia's reaction. That surprise reveals how profoundly detached Western strategic thinking has become from the hard realities of power. For years, the prevailing assumption in Western capitals was that Russia's red lines were flexible, negotiative, but red lines grounded in survival are never flexible. When leaders signal that they may respond to escalation with force, including against NATO targets, they are not improvising. They are acting within the logic that great powers have followed throughout history. The lesson is straightforward. When a great power believes its vital interests are under threat, it will do whatever is necessary to protect them, even at enormous cost. Russia's latest warning is not a shift in policy. It is a reaffirmation of the structural logic that governs international politics. The West ignored that logic for too long, and it now finds itself in a crisis of its own making, confronting a nuclear-armed adversary that believes it has been pushed to the brink. When I look at the trajectory of this war, it is clear to me that Western involvement crossed a decisive threshold the moment long-range strike systems became central to Ukraine's operational strategy. Before that shift, NATO could plausibly claim that it was merely helping Ukraine defend its territory. But once Storm Shadow missiles, attacks, and increasingly precise intelligence enabled targeting entered the picture, the boundary between Ukrainian agency and NATO direction effectively dissolved. These weapons did not simply extend Ukraine's reach, they fundamentally altered the strategic character of the conflict, and they created the conditions under which Russia concluded that it was no longer facing a proxy war, but a NATO-orchestrated campaign aimed at degrading its core security asset. The West underestimated what these systems represented. Storm shadow and are not just longer sticks. They are tools designed for deep strike missions, hitting command centers, airbases, logistical nodes, and early warning infrastructure far behind the front line when they began striking targets in Crimea, Belgorod, and other regions that Russia considers sovereign territory. Moscow viewed them as instruments of coercion, not mere battlefield support. The fact that Western intelligence, satellite guidance, and mission planning were closely integrated into these strikes only amplified the perception that NATO was directing the war's operational tempo. From a realist perspective, the logic here is unambiguous. If a great power sees a rival conducting or enabling strikes deep inside its homeland, it interprets that as a direct threat to its survival. No major state will tolerate such actions indefinitely. Yet Western leaders convinced themselves that Moscow would react with restraint because they assumed Russia was too weak, too cautious, or too fearful of escalation to respond. That belief was detached from the historical record. Great powers facing what they perceive as existential dangers typically escalate to restore deterrence, not back down. Russia's warnings today, therefore, flow directly from the structural incentives embedded in the international system. Another miscalculation lay in the West's failure to grasp what Crimea and Donbass mean to Russian strategic thinking. For the United States, these regions appear to be bargaining chips in a broader geopolitical contest. But for Russia, they are core interests tied to historical identity, military geography, and national pride. When NATO-backed systems struck Crimea, home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, it was perceived not as a tactical inconvenience, but as an assault on a central pillar of Russian security. Washington may see these strikes as calibrated, but Moscow sees them as a step toward dismantling its regional deterrent. Equally important is how Western technology blurred operational responsibility. Ukraine does not possess the reconnaissance networks, satellite architecture, or mission guidance frameworks required for successful deep strike campaigns at scale. Those elements come from NATO, and when a state becomes dependent on a patron for target selection and real-time intelligence, its battlefield actions inevitably reflect the patron's strategic preferences. From Moscow's perspective, the hand pulling the trigger matters less than the hand pointing to the target. Once that dynamic became undeniable, Russia concluded that NATO itself had become an active combatant. All of this reveals a broader tragedy. The West mistook incremental escalation for controlled escalation. Each new weapons package was framed as measured and reversible. But when those weapons enabled attacks inside Russia, the escalation became structural rather than tactical. The moment deep strike systems entered the conflict, the war ceased to be confined to Ukraine's territory. It became a contest over Russia's own security space, the kind of contest great powers rarely accept without forceful countermeasures. This threshold was not crossed suddenly. It was crossed through a series of decisions made in Western capitals under the illusion that modern warfare could be micromanaged without provoking symmetrical escalation. Now, with Russia openly threatening to strike NATO targets, the consequences of that illusion are starkly visible. The West misread the nature of the tools it introduced, and in doing so, redefined the war in ways it never intended. As I reflect on the current state of the conflict, what troubles me most is how easily miscalculation has evolved into the central operating principle of Western strategy. Escalation in great power politics rarely begins with a deliberate decision to court catastrophe. It arises through a series of small steps, each taken under the assumption that the other side will tolerate just a bit more pressure. The tragedy is that these assumptions accumulate. They form a chain of actions and reactions that gradually narrows the room for compromise. In Ukraine, this chain has now become a spiral, one driven not by careful strategy, but by repeated Western misreadings of Russian resolve. The pattern started early. Each time the West decided to send a new weapon system, first javelins, then long-range strike capabilities, the logic was the same. This will change the battlefield without provoking a major Russian response. When those predictions failed, the goalposts quietly shifted. The decision to escalate further became rationalized by the belief that previous escalations had not triggered immediate disaster, yet that belief ignored a fundamental reality. Great powers often signal resolve incrementally, building pressure until they reach a point where restraint no longer serves their interests. Russia has signaled consistently, and at each step, Western policymakers interpreted those signals as empty threats. This miscalculation is rooted in a deeper intellectual failure. Many Western leaders believe escalation can be engineered with precision, that they can calibrate the level of risk down to individual weapon systems or geographic areas. But escalation rarely follows tidy lines. It unfolds through perceptions of intent, assessments of capability, and the narrative states construct about one another's goals. When Russia sees NATO's fingerprints on strikes deep inside its territory, it does not parse technical distinctions. It interprets these actions as steps toward a broader encirclement strategy. And once that belief takes hold, even limited escalatory moves by the West look like components of a long-term plan to weaken the Russian state. That perception is not irrational. From Moscow's perspective, NATO has expanded steadily toward its borders, armed Ukraine to unprecedented levels, and now enables strikes that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. In such a context, Russia assumes Keat reasonably from a realist standpoint that Western assistance is designed to shift the regional balance of power in ways that threaten its security. This assumption then shapes its own escalation choices. When Russia warns that future strikes may hit NATO directly, it is not improvising, it is responding to a structural trajectory that the West set in motion and then failed to understand. The escalation spiral is also reinforced by domestic political incentives. Western governments, particularly in Europe, have invested enormous political capital in portraying Ukraine's survival as a test of Western credibility. Once credibility becomes tied to battlefield outcomes, leaders find themselves compelled to escalate even when their strategic position is deteriorating. Russia, meanwhile, frames the conflict as an existential struggle, a narrative that grants its leadership wide latitude to intensify the war. When both sides are driven by pressures that make backing down costly, the spiral tightens. What makes this moment so dangerous is that miscalculation is now embedded in the very logic of policy. Western states continue to assume that Russia's threshold for escalation is high. Russia continues to assume that NATO is inching toward direct intervention, and each side believes it is acting defensively, even as its actions appear offensive to the other. This is how wars between great powers historically cross the threshold into catastrophe, not through deliberate choice, but through accumulated misunderstanding. The crisis we face today is the predictable result of ignoring these dynamics. When miscalculation becomes strategy, the path ahead narrows. Russia has concluded that escalation is now necessary to restore deterrence. The West remains convinced that it can keep pushing without triggering decisive retaliation. These beliefs cannot coexist indefinitely. As Russia's warnings grow sharper and the battlefield realities shift decisively in Moscow's favor, what we now see in Western capitals is a mixture of confusion, Daniel, and private panic. Publicly, leaders continue to speak with the language of resolve, insisting that Ukraine must prevail and that Western unity remains unshaken. But behind the scenes, the mood is far more anxious. Officials in Washington, Berlin, Paris, and Brussels understand that the strategic balance has moved in Russia's direction and that the tools they once relied upon to shape the conflict are no longer producing meaningful results. The gap between public rhetoric and private assessment has widened into a chasm. For years, Western leaders operated under the assumption that their economic and military superiority would be sufficient to pressure Russia into concessions. They believed sanctions would the Russian economy, that weapons deliveries would give Ukraine a decisive edge, and that Russia's political system would fracture under the weight of prolonged war. None of these predictions came to pass. Instead, Russia adapted, rebuilt its industrial base, and demonstrated a level of resilience that Western planners did not anticipate. Each misjudgment deepened the panic now visible in Western policymaking circles. What makes this panic especially acute is the realization that the West has reached the limit of what it can plausibly do without entering the war directly. Ukraine's manpower shortages are severe, its infrastructure is degraded, and its ability to sustain large-scale operations depends almost entirely on Western. But the West cannot supply the one resource that matters most in a prolonged war: soldiers. That reality has forced Western leaders to confront a grim truth. Their strategy relied on a partner whose structural disadvantages could not be overcome with technology alone. Now that these disadvantages have become decisive, Western states find themselves trapped between untenable choices. The panic in Europe is particularly striking. The continent is deeply divided. The frontline states, especially Poland and the Baltic countries, push for harder lines and demand stronger guarantees, fearing they may be next if Ukraine collapses. Meanwhile, major Western European states quietly recoil from the possibility of direct confrontation with Russia. They know their armed forces are under-resourced, their ammunition stockpiles depleted, and their industrial capacity insufficient to sustain a long war. These governments are not prepared for a conflict with a nuclear-armed great power. Yet they cannot admit this publicly without undermining NATO's credibility. As a result, Europe's political discourse is dominated by posturing rather than strategy. Washington faces a different but equally severe dilemma. American policymakers know that Russia's warning about striking NATO targets is not a bluff. The United States must now consider whether it is willing to risk a war with a nuclear peer to defend alliance members who enabled escalatory strikes that Washington itself authorized or encouraged. This is the kind of credibility trap great powers dread. If the United States does not respond to an attack on a NATO asset, the alliance's deterrent value collapses. But if it does respond, the risk of uncontrolled escalation becomes unacceptably high. American leaders are therefore caught between two disastrous outcomes, each carrying consequences they cannot fully control. The panic also reflects an intellectual reckoning. For decades, Western states assumed they could manage escalation through superior technology, economic dominance, and alliance cohesion. They believed in the myth of strategic invulnerability, the idea that they could push rivals without facing serious retaliation. Russia's threat to hit NATO targets has shattered that illusion. It demonstrates that the West's ability to shape global events is far more limited than its leaders believed, and it reveals how deeply the West misunderstood the strategic logic that drives great powers when they believe their core interests are at stake. In the end, the panic in Western capitals is not simply about Ukraine's battlefield trajectory, it is about the collapse of a worldview. The sudden realization that the West is no longer in control of the strategic environment it spent decades constructing. The limits of power long ignored have returned with full force. As Russia sharpens its warning that future strikes may target NATO assets directly, the alliance now confronts the most dangerous stress test in its history. Article 5. The Collective Defense Clause has long been treated as sacrosanct, the foundation upon which NATO's deterrent posture rests. Yet few Western leaders have ever grappled seriously with what Article 5 actually requires when the adversary is a nuclear-armed great power with the capability and willingness to strike back. The current crisis forces NATO to confront a dilemma it has spent decades avoiding. Honoring its commitments may lead to annihilation, while failing to honor them may destroy the credibility upon which the alliance depends. This is the paradox of Article 5. It was designed during the early Cold War not as a mechanism for automatic retaliation, but as a political signal, a way to convey unity without guaranteeing that every attack would trigger a direct military response. The text itself is deliberately ambiguous, allowing each member state to choose the form of its assistance. Yet over the decades, the clause came to be interpreted as a near-automatic commitment to collective military action. Political symbolism gradually hardened into perceived obligation. Today, that perception collides with the harsh realities of nuclear deterrence. If Russia were to strike a NATO logistics hub, rather site or air base, facilitating deep strike operations in Ukraine, the alliance would face an excruciating choice: retaliate militarily and risk triggering a wider war with a nuclear peer that possesses the means to devastate Europe. Decline to retaliate and expose Article 5 as a hollow promise. Either outcome carries profound consequences. This is why NATO leaders are so uneasy. The alliance was not designed to manage direct conflict with a nuclear-armed Russia in a world where the United States is increasingly constrained by domestic political pressures, and Europe lacks the military capacity to fight a high-intensity war behind closed doors. Policymakers fully understand this. European militaries are ill-prepared for sustained conflict. Ammunition stockpiles are depleted, air defenses are insufficient, and ground forces are far smaller than they were during the Cold War. Even the most hawkish governments know their ability to fight Russia is limited. Public rhetoric about unity masks a deeper fear that NATO's deterrent credibility now rests largely on American willpower, and that the United States may hesitate when forced to choose between European security and the risk of nuclear escalation. For Washington, this dilemma is equally severe. The United States cannot afford to appear weak. Yet its leaders know that a direct war with Russia would entail catastrophic risks. American strategists understand the logic of nuclear deterrence as well as anyone once great powers perceive existential threats. Escalation ladders lose their rungs. A conflict that begins with limited strikes can quickly spiral out of control. In such a scenario, the traditional tools of statecraft sanctions, alliances, and diplomatic pressure offer little protection. This reality has left U.S. policymakers in a strategic bind with no painless exit. This moment also exposes a deeper flaw in NATO's post-Cold War evolution. The alliance expanded aggressively into Eastern Europe, extending Article 5 commitments to states located deep within Russia's historical buffer zones. Western leaders assumed that because they were the world's preeminent power bloc, they could expand indefinitely, without confronting the full implications of their security guarantees. But power has limits and commitments have consequences. NATO now faces the bill for decades of strategic overreach. The core lesson is unavoidable. Collective defense commitments are only as credible as the willingness and capability to honor them under the most extreme conditions. When Article 5 is tested not by a small power or a terrorist group, but by a nuclear-armed state that sees the conflict as existential, the risks become nearly unmanageable. The dilemma now confronting NATO is not a sign of weak. It is a reminder that alliances cannot eliminate the underlying constraints of the international system. The alliance must now decide whether it is prepared to risk nuclear confrontation for the sake of maintaining credibility, or whether it will accept the political cost of restraint. Neither choice offers safety. That is the tragedy of the moment. Article 5, designed to preserve stability, may instead become the mechanism through which Europe confronts its most dangerous crisis since 1945. As I assess the trajectory of Western strategy in Ukraine, what stands out most clearly is the enduring belief that escalation could be controlled, calibrated, and ultimately dominated by the West. This belief that the West could shape the battlefield, manage risks, and dictate outcomes forms the core illusion that now lies in ruins. Great power politics has never worked this way. When states pursue strategies that threaten the vital interests of a nuclear-armed adversary, control evaporates and the logic of survival takes over. The West failed to understand this reality, and as a result, it now finds itself grappling with forces it cannot contain. From the outset, Western leaders imagined that they could impose costs on Russia while insulating themselves from the consequences. They believed sanctions would the Russian economy, that advanced weapons would tilt the balance in Ukraine's favor, and that Russia's political leadership would be weakened by prolonged conflict by 2023. It was already clear these assumptions were wrong. The Russian economy adapted, military production surged, and the political system consolidated rather than fractured. Yet, instead of recalibrating, Western policymakers doubled down, convinced that with the right mix of assistance, they could still compel Russia to change course. This revealed the deeper illusion, the belief that Western technological superiority translates into strategic control. The introduction of HIMARS, Storm Shadow ATACMS, and advanced air defense systems was accompanied by the same refrain. This will change Russia's calculus without provoking retaliation. But deterrence does not work on the basis of technical specifications. It works on the basis of perceived threats to core interests. Russia was not deterred because it did not interpret these actions as limited. It interpreted them as a creeping attempt to degrade its strategic depth and impose external constraints on its sovereignty. Western officials assumed they could manage escalation through incremental steps, but every new step accumulated within Moscow's threat perception. And once Russia concluded that NATO involvement was no longer peripheral but central, the dynamic shifted from controlled escalation to systemic escalation, the point at which states no longer respond to individual actions but to the trajectory those actions collectively represent. That is why Russia's message today is so stark. It is no longer responding to individual provocations, but to what it sees as an overarching Western strategy to weaken and encircle it. Another component of the illusion came from Western domestic politics. Leaders in Washington and Europe portrayed Ukraine's success as a matter of moral clarity and geopolitical necessity. They promised victory despite lacking the industrial base, manpower, or long-term political cohesion required for such an outcome. Public messaging created expectations that could not be reconciled with battlefield realities. Once Ukraine's position deteriorated, the political need to maintain an image of control led to further escalation, not because it was strategically sound, but because Western leaders feared the domestic consequences of acknowledging failure. The final illusion was the belief that time favored the West. In reality, time favored Russia. Moscow had the capacity to mobilize industry, adapt tactics, and sustain losses at a level Ukraine, and certainly Europe could not match. The longer the war continued, the clearer Russia's advantages became, yet Western policymakers continued to speak of attrition as though it were a contest the West could dominate. That assumption was fatally flawed. By the time many Western capitals recognized the imbalance, it was too late to reverse it. The consequences of these illusions are now fully apparent. Russia holds the initiative. Ukraine is exhausted. NATO is confronted with the possibility of direct retaliation, and the West finds itself reacting rather than shaping events, trapped in a strategic position defined by commitments. It can neither fully uphold nor abandon without severe costs. The failure of Western strategy is not merely operational, it is conceptual. It reflects a fundamental refusal to accept that in great power conflicts, control is an illusion. When the adversary believes its survival is at stake, the West built its approach on wishful thinking. Russia built its response on realism. The outcome was inevitable. As I look across the strategic landscape shaped by this war, what strikes me is how forcefully reality has reasserted itself. For years, Western states embraced a worldview built on optimism, moral rhetoric, and the belief that liberal hegemony could reshape international politics. They assumed that norms, institutions, and economic leverage would bend adversaries to their will. But the crisis now confronting the West shows that the fundamental forces I have spent my career studying, power, fear, and the logic of survival, remain the true drivers of state behavior. The return of realism was not invited. It has been imposed by events. The first lesson is that great powers do not tolerate threats near their borders. This is a structural fact of international politics, not a quirk of Russian history. The United States has long followed the same logic, enforcing its Monroe Doctrine with overwhelming force whenever external powers attempted to gain influence in the Western Hemisphere. Yet many Western policymakers convinced themselves that Russia would behave differently, that it would accept NATO expansion, Western-backed revolutions, and foreign military assistance in its immediate neighborhood without responding forcefully. That belief rested on a profound misunderstanding of how great powers perceive threats. Russia's reaction to NATO involvement in Ukraine was not an anomaly. It was the predictable consequence of placing a military alliance on its doorstep. The second lesson is that military capability, not rhetoric, shapes strategic outcome. Western leaders often spoke as though moral clarity or political resolve could compensate for material disadvantages. They underestimated Russia's industrial capacity, its ability to adapt under pressure, and its willingness to absorb costs in a conflict it views as existential. Realism teaches that states fight hardest when vital interests are at stake. Russia behaved accordingly. The West, by contrast, believed it could manage the war with limited commitment. That asymmetry ensured the outcome we now observe. A third lesson concerns the limits of alliance politics. NATO's strength rests on the belief that all members will come to one another's aid, but that belief has never been tested against a direct confrontation with a nuclear peer. As Russia's warnings intensify, the ambiguity built into Article 5 becomes a source of anxiety rather than reassurance. The alliance must now grapple with the possibility that maintaining credibility may bring intolerable risks. Realism reminds us that commitments must be weighed against capability and willingness. When those diverge, alliances become fragile. The current crisis demonstrates just how fragile NATO's strategic cohesion has become. The fourth lesson is that escalation cannot be indefinitely controlled. Western policymakers treated the conflict as though they could introduce increasingly sophisticated weapons while remaining insulated from the consequences. They framed each escalation as limited and reversible. But once deep strike systems enabled attacks inside Russia, escalation became structural, not tactical. Realism teaches that states respond to trajectories, not individual actions. The West failed to grasp this, and Russia responded with threats that now place the entire alliance structure under strain. The final lesson is that power politics remains the foundation of the international system. Liberal aspirations cannot erase the reality that states pursue survival above all else, that geography matters, and that military balances shape outcomes more decisively than moral arguments. The West's belief that it could sidestep these realities was always untenable. The current crisis reveals what happens when ideology blinds policymakers to the forces that actually govern international politics. If there is a path forward, it begins with acknowledging these realities. The West must recognize that the post-Cold War era of unchallenged dominance is over. It must accept that adversaries have agency, that spheres of influence remain a feature of global politics, and that pushing against the vital interests of nuclear-armed great powers carries grave risk. Realism is not a pessimistic doctrine. It is a sober one. It teaches prudence, restraint, and respect for the dangers inherent in an anarchic world. This crisis offers the West a stark reminder power has limits, and ignoring those limits produces disaster. The return to realism is not a choice. It is the only path left for those who wish to avoid an even more catastrophic confrontation.